free and fair elections. I think from a process perspective, I do think having a ballot that a voter can actually look at and verify before they cast it is really important. I would recommend against going to digital, or even in some cases systems that are not digital but don't create a paper ballot. You need a permanent or close to permanent record, especially in countries that have a secret ballot, which is a best practice as well, where that ballot can be reviewed long after the voter is gone. So I think paper is important. I think one area in which all democracies of the world share common goals right now, though, are efforts to combat disinformation. Every democracy in the world, to some degree, is facing unprecedented disinformation, lies being spread about the process. So I think there's two broad categories of disinformation, one I work on and one I don't work on. The one I don't work on is what I call campaign disinformation. Disinformation that's designed to cast a particular candidate in a negative light. Disinformation that might spread lies about a candidate, particularly in this era of artificial intelligence, disinformation that could be used to create a fake video of a candidate or fake audio. We had that situation in New Hampshire where there was a fake audio of Joe Biden going around. That's more in the campaign context, and I don't do so much work on that. I do have concerns about it, of course. There are disinformation can be used, especially if there's little time to correct it, to create the false impression amongst voters in a variety of ways. We've had that for a long time. Artificial intelligence creates a bigger problem with that, but it's been around. The other kind is disinformation about the election process. Disinformation about when, how, where to vote, whether there are problems. You could see disinformation being spread. And this is something we've seen for a long time. Occasionally you would see, even 20, 30 years ago, flyers being put on windshields or spread around a neighborhood that said, Republicans vote on Tuesday, Democrats vote on Wednesday. There's no voting on Wednesday. And these would be put in areas where predominantly Democrats were thought. Now that's unsophisticated. That's a broad target. And it was fairly easy to fix and tell. Devastating effect on American voter confidence overall. As I mentioned, those lies have led to attacks on public servants, on election officials around the country. Those lies clearly contributed to the attack on the United States Capitol on January 6th, 2021. Those lies have led to some negative policies with regard to election integrity. I mentioned the Electronic Registration Information Center, which is helping states. Many states which are run by allies of the former president have withdrawn from that, which makes their voter lists less accurate, which means there are more problems that are going to occur. Many of the former president's allies are actively seeking to remove some of the guardrails around our elections so there can be more chaos, more opportunity to raise money. People who've spread lies about the election have raised hundreds of millions of dollars over the last several years, perhaps even more than $1 billion.
Using social media or just getting that money from different donors?
Usually from individuals, so social media, but electronic means, rallies, it can be personal, but not so much from institutional donors. It happens occasionally. You may be familiar with the MyPillow guy, if you've heard that term, a guy named Mike Lindell, who runs a pillow company, but has been one of the primary sources of lies about the 2020 election. If you live in a democracy, one of the things that is difficult is an election is inherently a system where you determine who's going to govern and who loses. It's often said amongst those of us who work in the democracy space that a point of an election, and to so many of the procedures that you have, is to convince the loser and the loser supporters that they lost. The winner doesn't need any convincing, right? So that means that we as citizens in democracies have to accept the disappointment that comes with losing. That's the whole point of an election. I don't know many people who've only voted for winning candidates in their lives. They'd either have to be very young or live in countries that maybe aren't true democracies, where there isn't true competition. But America is very closely divided politically, and with that should come the understanding that when the ballots are counted, the person you voted for might have lost, and that should not come as a surprise to anyone. What we're seeing now with the lies being spread by the former president and many of his allies is that the only definition of an election that's secure is an election that they win. It's not about any of the procedures, it's only about the outcomes. That is why the 2020 election, which was by every objective measure much more secure than the 2016 election in the United States. That doesn't mean the 2016 election had any problems, but 2020 was more secure, more paper ballots. I mentioned 95% of people voted on paper ballots in 2020. That was only about 75 to 80% in 2016. The entire states of Georgia and South Carolina had no paper ballots in 2016. All paper in 2020. North Carolina, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, somewhat closely divided states, all paper ballots in 2020, whereas they had significant numbers of digital ballots in 2016. So objectively speaking, we knew the 2020 election was much more secure. You didn't hear any of the president complain about any of the procedures in 2016 that led to his legitimate victory. Actually remarkable. We needed the technology to accurately count and count them quickly. It's actually remarkable how well the United States does in this. I know, I imagine that when you wake up Wednesday morning, November 6th, you're going to want to know immediately who won the presidency in the United States. Everyone in the United States wants to know at 8:01 p.m. who won the presidency in the United States. It's extremely normal. But when I tell people what's actually happening, what's happening is we have ballots with multiple pages and dozens of races in 10,000 different jurisdictions being counted by 1 million volunteers all over the country and then reported up to their 10,000 counties, who then report those results up to their 50 states. And then we have margins that are narrow. It's actually remarkable we learn who won the presidency as early as we do in many cases. When the margins are narrow, we're going to take extra time to make sure we've accurately counted those ballots and audited them. And so one thing I think the entire international community, as well as Americans, need to understand is it is likely to take days until we know who won the presidency, and that is entirely normal. That does not mean anything nefarious is going on. It means that a process that we already had in place is working as it should. In states like California, I don't know if you'll wake up early enough in the morning to know when California's results of issues out there that make it less likely for people to accept election outcomes that they don't like. But we're very narrowly divided, which kind of gets to your question about exit polls. If you'll see a lot of data on polling, you'll see a lot of data on exit polling. And one thing that polls and exit polls do is they take a small sample and they try to extrapolate it out to tell you what's going on within a whole state or the whole country. The problem with that is when margins get very, very narrow, those polls don't tell you so much. In order to really know who won a state that's decided by 10,000 votes, you might need a poll. The United States is the oldest continuous democracy in the world. Our Constitution was written very close to 250 years ago. At that time, the right to vote was not offered to everybody who was a citizen of the United States. It was only property-owning white males. And over time, we've been able to amend the Constitution to have what we call universal suffrage, where all citizens, regardless of race or gender over the age of 18, are guaranteed the right to vote. The Electoral College remains and is likely to continue to remain. That was a compromise reached between the original 13 colonies, new states in the United States, to try to ensure, much like the U.S. Senate also, because the U.S. Senate is not a proportional body either. The state of Wyoming has the same number of senators as the state of California, even though it is less than 1% of the size, or about 1% of the size. So some of these things were enshrined to ensure that the 13 colonies, which were to become states and thought of themselves as almost independent countries, would come together as a federal government but retain some autonomy in what the federal government could do. Whether that was a good bargain or not is largely moot now, because in order to amend the Constitution, you need 3/4 of the states to agree, and over half the states benefit from the Electoral College. They get more representation than they would ordinarily. So it's here to stay. But I'll also make another important point. Al Gore in 2000 won the popular vote by a small margin, 500,000 votes, and lost the presidency. Hillary Clinton won by about 3 million votes but lost the presidency. John Kerry came very close to winning the state of Ohio and losing the popular vote and beating President Bush in 2004. But those rules were known to the campaigns and the candidates well in advance. No one likes all of the rules of elections. I'm imagining they don't like all the rules of elections. Some, people have different rules of elections they don't like in your countries as well. That's certainly true here in the United States. But we all know those rules. The fact that Hillary Clinton needed to win 270 of our electoral votes was not a surprise to her. And that's why she conceded. I mean, she legitimately lost the 2016 election under the rules that we had. The candidates know this. They know where they need to campaign. They know where they need to run. One advantage to the candidates, and I'm not saying this is a good advantage, but one advantage to the candidates is if with the Electoral College they don't need to go and campaign in every state. California will not see a presidential candidate after Tuesday, except for them to raise money. That's because where California's electoral votes are going are not in doubt. So the candidates can really concentrate their efforts on the states that are narrowly divided, which are fewer than 10. And from a campaign perspective, that might benefit them to some degree. And many people don't like the Electoral College, but whether it's good for American democracy or not, everybody knows it's the law, and everyone can operate appropriately to try to achieve victory through the Electoral College. Yeah. And domestically. I mean,
influence how much?
I think what we're seeing, this is an area I work in quite a bit. A lot of the foreign disinformation is not so much creating new content, but amplifying and targeting content that already exists in the United States. And we have more domestic actors doing that. That being said, there are examples of foreign attacks that were not just disinformation, but also cyber attacks. In 2016, the Russians infiltrated the state of Illinois' voter registration database in the summer of 2016. They had access to it and were sitting inside that database for 2 weeks without anyone noticing them because they were not active in there. And after not being noticed for a few weeks, they all of a sudden vastly increased the number of records they were accessing. And this was noticed immediately, within seconds, literally seconds, and the Illinois election officials shut down all access to the voter registration database. Nothing was changed. The question we got asked often is, if the Russians had successfully infiltrated a voter registration database, why would they do something that would make it so obvious that they were in there? And the answer is pretty clear. They wanted us to know they were in there. They wanted Americans to worry about cyber attacks on their technology. As it turns out, that cyber attack would not have been successful if they tried to do something. Voter registration databases have some public information in them as well as some private information. There are backups of these. We do research on this and put out a study on this every 2 years. There are backups of that data made regularly. It would be fairly easy to reconstruct it even if they completely wiped the database that they were in. And they did this in July, way before the election, and it was in Illinois, which was not going to be a swing state. It's a state with very large margins statewide for Democrats. So very clearly they wanted it to be known that Russia was inside. And then we see actors domestically creating messages that say, we can't trust our technology. And then the circle continues where foreign adversaries amplify and target those messages. And I think this is one of the big concerns about artificial intelligence, is we've been dealing with videos and audio disinformation for some time. The ability of artificial intelligence to create audio and also interactive audio and text, where someone is actually communicating with someone they think is someone they trust and is actually not. The ability to use artificial intelligence to finally and individually target people who are most susceptible to particular types of disinformation. I mentioned the flyers. That is much more of a shotgun approach. You're just hoping it hits somebody that it might affect. But with artificial intelligence and social media and other forms of electronic communication, you could identify a particular individual who you think is most likely to vote for the candidate you want to lose, and then target them for specific information that you think is going to be most likely to get them to decide not to vote or to be unable to vote for some reason. And there's no question there's a very strong foreign element to that.
Do you still have time to ask questions for us?
I'm sorry?
Do you still?
Oh, yeah, I can stay till 11, so I'm different than anywhere else in the world, and they're often not the things that either Americans or people who live outside of the United States think are different about our elections. Yes, we have some unusual rules like the Electoral College and electing a president, etc. But the single biggest difference in our elections in the United States compared to every place else in the world is how decentralized our elections are, how our process is incredibly decentralized. Unlike virtually every other nation in the world, we do not have an independent national election commission or an election body that runs elections. In fact, we don't even have just 50 election bodies for each state. Any national election in the United States is actually not one election. It's about 10,000 little elections all over the country, run at the same time, all with often with different ballots, different issues on the ballots, different races, different technology, different election officials running those systems. The date for a federal election is set in the Constitution, but the power to run those elections is given by the Constitution to the states. So each state has what's called a chief election official. In most cases, that's called the Secretary of State. It's not like Secretary of State Blinken. It is a position in the states, often elected, but not always, sometimes appointed, where that person oversees elections and usually other issues like business licensing, corporate registration, those kinds of things. Sometimes states have a state election board or election commission instead of a Secretary of State. There's a couple of states where they would like to see American democracy weakened. And what some of those people have been doing is they have been abusing, harassing, and threatening these public servants in the United States. I should note also, I don't know if you've ever met an American election official. These are not rich, powerful positions. These are clerk positions. These are bureaucrat positions. These are positions people take and they make a modest income and they work very hard and no one ever notices them. It used to be the only time election officials in the United States would get noticed was when something went wrong. People don't talk about the election process if everything goes right. They just move on to the next thing. They only notice it when it goes wrong. So these public servants have been attacked for well over 3 years now. And oftentimes it is, there are people who believe the lies about the election who sit in positions of power in some localities, in some counties, who are causing the problems for election officials. And they often need legal advice and support because they're worried for their own safety, for the safety of their families, for the safety of their staffs, for the security of their facilities. They are very stressed out right now. We are seeing more election officials leave than we have in the past. And yet our elections are still running pretty well. I mean, if you look at the 2022 election where we had a relatively high turnout, to put this into context, I mentioned we had 67% turnout in 2020. I would say average American turnout in a presidential election is around 60%, give or take.